Ma'am, eyes up. This is a live operations floor, not the lobby. I don't know who walked you back here, but this place is for grown-ups, sweetie. So let's get you up and walk you back to the visitor's lounge before something with a clearance scares you. The voice carried across the room before anything else did. It bounced off the cooling fans and the low banks of monitors and the long curved wall of screens, and a few heads turned, and a few did not. Because at 1 o'clock in the morning on a real-world night, most of the people in a joint operations center have learned to keep their eyes on the feed and let the floor sort out its own small dramas. The room was a cave of blue light. 2 stories of screens climbed the front wall, carrying map overlays and grainy aerial feeds and the slow crawl of position markers, and beneath them sat 3 tiers of watch positions, each man and woman bent into a headset, each speaking the clipped half-language of a live mission. The air smelled of burnt coffee and machine heat. Somewhere, a radio hissed and resolved into a voice and went quiet again. At the very back of the floor, against the wall, in a plain chair that nobody used, sat a woman in civilian clothes, a simple blue jacket, dark trousers, a paper cup of coffee, long gone cold, resting on her knee. A single laminated badge hung from a clip at her collar, the kind the front desk handed out to escorts and visitors. And it was this badge the young man had seen, and from it he had built his entire understanding of her. She did not look at him. She looked at the center screen, the largest one, the one carrying the live feed, and she was the only person in that room who was not, in some small animal way, afraid of it. She watched it the way a surgeon watches a monitor, not in fear of the thing on the screen, but responsible for it. Her face was still. Her hands were still. She sat with the stillness of someone who had already done the frightening part of a night like this many times, in places far worse than a clean room full of coffee and air conditioning. The young man was First Lieutenant Nolan Easton, and he was 24 years old, and he was the junior battle captain on the overnight watch, which on this particular night made him feel like the most important man in the building. His uniform was pressed. A headset hung around his neck. He had been waiting his whole short career for a real-world mission to run on his floor, and now one was. And the last thing he intended to allow was some stray contractor in a blue jacket sitting in his cave of light, watching things she had no business watching. He crossed half the floor toward her. A couple of the junior watchstanders glanced up, caught the tone, and let small smirks form, the way men do when they sense someone is about to be put in their place, and they are glad it is not them. "Did you hear me?" Easton said, planting himself in front of her chair. "Visitors' lounge. There's a nice couch. You can wait for whoever forgot about you." The woman finally answered. 2 words. Her eyes never left the screen. "I'll stay." Easton's jaw tightened. He was not used to that. Not the refusal, but the flatness of it. The complete absence of the flutter he expected from a civilian who had been caught somewhere she shouldn't be. He opened his mouth to say something larger. Behind him, at the back coffee mess, a heavy-set man in uniform set down his own cup very slowly. Command Sergeant Major Hector Salinas had been in rooms like this one for almost 30 years, and he had learned to read them the way the woman in the blue jacket was reading the screen. He had clocked 2 things in the last 10 seconds, and they had stopped him cold. The first was that when the aviation push had keyed up on the net a moment ago and stepped on another call sign, the woman's eyes had flicked to the correct quadrant of the map a full half-second before the controllers had, before the radio had even confirmed it. She had heard the collision coming. The second was smaller and somehow louder. When she had reached down a minute earlier to set her coffee on the floor and then changed her mind and lifted it back to her knee. She had done it without looking. Squared, economical, the cup placed exactly where her hand expected it to be. It was nothing. It was the kind of nothing that took 20 years in hard places to make ordinary. Salinas did not say anything. He picked his cup back up, and he watched the woman in the blue jacket, and he began, quietly, to wonder. On the screen, the position markers crawled toward a dark shape that was someone's whole night, and the woman watched them go, and the young lieutenant stood over her, certain he understood everything in the room. He understood nothing. Easton decided, in the way that young men decide things, that the problem was procedure. If he made it about procedure, he could not be wrong. "All right," he announced, loud enough for the nearer positions to hear. "Here's how this works. You're unescorted on a live floor. That's a security issue, not a hospitality issue. I'm going to call the visitor's desk. They're going to send someone, and you're going to go with them. Easy." He keyed a desk phone, made a show of it, narrated it. "Yeah, this is the battle captain. I've got an unescorted visitor on the floor, back row. Need a runner to walk her out." He hung up like a man closing a deal. The woman said nothing. She watched the feed. And then the floor hit a snag. It was the kind of thing that happens 50 times a night and usually resolves itself in seconds. 2 call signs keyed the same net at the same instant, the ground element and the aviation push. And for a moment, the senior controller at the center position lost the thread of which marker was which. His hand hovered. He muttered a question to his assistant. On a live mission, 3 seconds of confusion is a long time. From the back of the room, evenly, without raising her voice, the woman said, "That's not your ground element on that net. That's the aviation push checking in early. Hold your call 30 seconds, and you'll get your window clean." The controller's head came around. So did Salinas's. The woman had named the convention, the element, and the window, the exact deconfliction, before anyone on the floor had untangled it. The controller hesitated, then did what she said. He held his call. 30 seconds later, the window opened clean, exactly as she had described, and the markers sorted themselves on the big screen. For a moment, nobody spoke. It was the kind of call that took a certain number of years in a certain kind of room to make automatic, not the knowing of the convention, which anyone could learn, but the calm to say it out loud in someone else's lane on a live mission, with the easy confidence of a person who had stood in worse rooms than this one and been right when it cost more than embarrassment. The controller, a staff sergeant who had pulled hundreds of these watches, gave the woman a second look, a long one, and then turned back to his feed with the faint discomfort of a man who has just been quietly out-soldiered by someone he had not bothered to notice. Easton recovered the only way he knew how. He decided the woman's competence was itself a crime. "How do you know that?" he said. And now there was an edge under the performance. "You're not cleared to know that. You overheard a briefing, didn't you? That's exactly the problem. That's exactly why you can't be back here." "Lieutenant," said Salinas quietly. But Easton was already moving. Salinas drifted closer to the woman's chair, off Easton's flank, and he spoke low, under the room, the way a senior man speaks when he is trying to find out something important without making a scene of it. "Ma'am," he said, "you been on a floor like this before?" The woman looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were calm and very tired, the tiredness of someone who had been awake a long time and through a great deal. "A few," she said. She said it the way operators say it, not the way a contractor says it, or an analyst, or a staff officer who had pulled some night shifts in a clean room and called it hard. She said it the way people say it, when "a few" means more than they will ever tell you, in rooms that do not have names. Salinas felt the small cold thing in his stomach grow a little larger. He stepped away to a side terminal, and without telling anyone why, he began to pull the night's access manifest. The list of every badge cleared onto the floor and the tier each one carried. Behind him, Easton, oblivious, kept performing for the room. He had an audience now. He intended to use it. Easton found, as cruel men sometimes do, that an audience made him braver and worse at the same time. "You know what I think?" he said, turning so the nearer positions could hear him, pitching it like a comedian finding his crowd. "I think we've got ourselves an auditor. Lady from contracts, here to grade the night shift. How are we doing, ma'am? Coffee up to standard? You going to ding us on the burnt pot?" A laugh came from his right. It belonged to Sergeant Wes Crandall, a watch floor NCO who was young enough to want very badly to be liked, and not yet wise enough to know by whom. Crandall leaned back in his chair. "You want me to get her a comment card, sir? She can rate the night shift. 2 stars, hostile lighting." A couple of the junior watchstanders laughed. It was not most of the room, but it was enough to make the back corner feel, for a moment, like a locker room. And a locker room is the easiest place in the world to forget that the person you are laughing at is a person at all. There is a particular cruelty that only blooms in front of an audience. Easton alone would never have said half of it. Easton with 3 people laughing was a different animal, larger and meaner. And he fed on the sound, the way a fire feeds on wind. Each laugh told him he was winning. He did not stop to ask what game he thought he was playing, or against whom, or what it would cost him to lose it, because the laughing felt exactly like the thing young men mistake their whole lives for being respected. The woman in the blue jacket did not move. She let it wash over her, the way a breakwater lets the surf break, without flinching, without answering, without giving any of it a surface to hold on to, because moving was not required, and she had long ago stopped doing anything that was not required. Her stillness wasn't the stillness of fear. The men who laughed could not tell the difference. There's a kind of calm that looks like meekness to people who have never seen the other kind, and looks like a loaded weapon to people who have. One watchstander, a young specialist 2 seats over, was not laughing. He had glanced toward the back of the room to share the joke with the sergeant major, the way you do, and he had found Salinas not laughing at all. Salinas was bent over a side terminal, and his face had gone the particular gray of a man reading something he did not believe. The specialist stopped smiling. He turned back to his screen and decided, privately, that he wanted no part of whatever this was. Easton, encouraged, went further. "Tell you what," he said to the woman, magnanimous now, playing the gracious host. "Mission's at a busy part. I'll let you sit there till it calms down. Then I personally am going to walk you to the lounge. There's a couch. You can have a nice nap, sweetheart, and dream about whatever briefing you weren't supposed to hear." Crandall snorted. At the side terminal, Salinas had gone very still. The manifest would not give him a name. That was the first wrong thing. Every badge on the floor resolved to a name except one, and that one resolved instead to a string of letters and a clearance tier. A tier he had seen exactly twice in 29 years, both times in rooms where the doors were guarded from the inside and nobody used last names. He stared at it. The badge clipped to the woman's collar, the cheap laminated escort badge that Easton had built his whole contempt upon, was not an escort badge at all. It was a cover. Underneath it, the system saw something else entirely. Salinas straightened. Across the floor, the lieutenant was still talking. If you have ever watched someone be talked down to by a person who had no idea who they were talking to, stay with this one and subscribe to the Veteran Vault. It stopped being a joke at 1:17 in the morning. Easton had decided, somewhere in the last few minutes, that the woman was no longer merely an inconvenience, but a genuine problem he could solve. And solving problems was what battle captains did, and being seen to solve one in front of the crew was even better. He keyed himself up into a posture of duty. He had learned the posture in a classroom and worn it like a coat that did not yet fit. "Okay. Enough," He came back across the floor and stood over her chair. I tried to be nice. You're unescorted. You're listening to traffic you're not read on, and you won't move. That makes you a security concern on a live operation. So this is happening now. The woman set her coffee cup on the floor beside the chair. She did it the way she did everything, without looking, with an economy that should have warned him and did not. She folded her hands in her lap. Easton mistook the calm for weakness, the way he had mistaken everything else. And because she would not give him fear, he reached for something he thought would. "You want to know what I really think?" he said. Lower now, meaner, leaning in so the cruelty was for her and not the crowd. "I think you're one of those people who plays soldier in their head, sits in a real ops center and pretends. People who play soldier in their heads don't get to sit on my floor. So get up." It was meant to wound. It was the oldest insult there was in a building like this one, the accusation of being a fraud, of wearing something you had not earned, even when the thing was only a chair and a cold cup of coffee. He watched her face for the flinch. There was no flinch. What there was, instead, was a small thing he would remember for the rest of his life and not understand, until later. The woman looked up at him, not angry, not afraid, just looking, the way you look at weather. And something moved behind her eyes, and then was deliberately put away. It was the look of a person deciding not to do something. He did not know what the something was. He only knew, for a half second, that he was very glad she had decided against it, and he could not have said why. Then he covered the feeling with authority, because that was all he had. He turned to the security desk position at the edge of the floor. "I need a hand walking a visitor off the deck." The man at the security desk hesitated. He looked at the woman. He looked at Salinas, who was crossing the floor now with the speed of a much younger man, and he looked back at Easton, and he was caught between three currents and chose, badly, to do nothing. Crandall hovered at Easton's shoulder, and the grin had thinned on his face, because some animal part of him had begun to register the sergeant major's expression, and the specialist, who had stopped laughing, and the way the back of the room had gone quiet in a manner that had nothing to do with the mission. "Lieutenant," Salinas said, sharp, still 10 feet away. "Stand by." But at that exact instant, the mission hit its critical phase. On the wall, the markers converged on the dark shape, and the net came alive with the fast-clipped traffic of an element going through a door somewhere on the other side of the world, and every controller on the floor bent into the feed at once, and the room's whole attention split down the middle, half on the screens, half on the small, ugly thing happening in the back corner. Easton reached her first. He put his hand on her upper arm to lift her out of the chair. The motion was rough, proprietary, the gesture of a man moving an object. And as he hauled her up, the laminated badge at her collar swung out on its clip and caught the blue light and turned, almost lazily, toward the security scanner mounted by the door. Salinas reached them a heartbeat later and got his voice down to the register that only Easton would hear, low and hard and absolutely without doubt. "Son, take your hand off her. Right now. You do not know who that is." Easton heard it as a challenge. That was the tragedy of him in the end, that a thing meant to save him sounded, to a young man performing for a crowd, exactly like a thing meant to humiliate him. A senior enlisted man was telling him to back down in front of the watch. Every instinct he had, all of them wrong, told him that backing down now was the one unsurvivable move. "With respect, Sergeant Major," Easton said, not lowering his voice at all. "This is an officer's call. She's unescorted and she won't comply. I'm removing her." "You are not listening to me." Salinas put himself half between them, and he tried the only lever he had that lived in the world of procedure, because procedure was the only language the lieutenant seemed able to hear. "The access manifest is showing a special access flag on that badge, a high one. I need you to stop, step back, and call the watch commander before you do one more thing. Do you understand me? Stop. And here was the thing that undid Nolan Easton. He heard the words manifest and flag, and instead of fear, he felt relief, because he assembled them into a story that flattered him. A contractor with a badge tier she shouldn't have, a system error, a security breach, and here he was, the only one alert enough to catch it. In his mind, the high flag was not proof that she was someone. It was proof that she was a one wearing the wrong coat. Then that's exactly the problem, Easton said, and there was something almost triumphant in it. A visitor badge reading a clearance like that? That's a breach. That's the whole point. I'm not backing off, I'm escalating. The woman spoke then, for the first time in minutes, and she did not speak to Easton, and she did not speak to defend herself. She turned her head a few degrees toward Salinas, and her voice was very quiet, and it carried the unmistakable weight of someone for whom the room's drama was the least important thing in it. Sergeant Major. Her eyes went back to the wall, to the markers at the dark shape, to the element going through the door. Let the mission finish. The rest can wait. Salinas heard it and knew. Mission first. Ego never. Not one word about herself, not 1 inch given to the insult. Only the instinct that the people on the screens mattered and she did not. The exact instinct he had spent a career trying to teach lieutenants, like the one in front of him, and almost never could. It confirmed the cold thing in his stomach completely. He knew now, past all doubt, who was sitting in the back of his floor in a cheap blue jacket. What the young lieutenant did not understand is what the next 90 seconds were about to teach him, in front of everyone he had wanted to impress. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Easton, humiliated by the sergeant major's tone and blind to everything it meant, made his final decision. He would prove it himself. He would walk her to the scanner by the door and badge her out and let the machine show the whole floor that she did not belong. He took her arm again and turned her toward the door, certain, all the way to the bone, that he was about to be proven right. Before the badge ever touched the reader, go back 10 years, to the night that made the woman in the blue jacket into the thing she was. It was 2016, and there was no moon. She was a captain then, and they did not call her by her name. They called her by the word that had attached itself to her somewhere in the second deployment and refused to come off. A word that meant the commander, the one who held the ground. On the net that night, she was Shadow Sisk's, and she lay in the dark 100 meters off a walled compound, with 30 of the best men and women the country had ever made, breathing slow and even around her. And she watched the building the way she would, a decade later, watch a screen. The compound was the whole night. Inside it was a man the intelligence people had spent 2 years building a folder on, and the folder said, the walls held that man, and perhaps 8 others. And the folder, like all folders, was a guess dressed as a fact. They went in clean. The breach was a single hard sound, and then the stack poured through it. And for 90 seconds, it was exactly the thing they had rehearsed 1,000 times until it lived below thought. Rooms cleared. Calls came back flat and correct. Captain Cassidy moved through the courtyard behind the lead element with the strange, floating calm that had always come over her in the worst moments. The calm that felt, from the inside, like time slowing down to let her keep up. Then the folder's guess came apart. A second structure, low and dark against the far wall. A structure the imagery had read as empty. It wasn't empty. It opened up. The night cracked across the courtyard, and the careful, clean thing they had built began, in seconds, to collapse. 2 of her people went down in the open. The element that had been a single organism became, for one terrible breath, 30 frightened human beings in a killing space. and Shadow 6 held the room. That was the only way anyone ever described it afterward, the ones who lived. She held the room. She did not shout. She came up on the net in the same flat voice she used for everything, and she called the audible, repositioned a team, collapsed a corner, put fire where it bought time and bodies where it bought lives, and the organism reassembled itself around the sound of her, because 30 people who are about to die will follow, above all things, the one voice that is not afraid. She crossed open ground twice. She pulled one of the downed operators back by his drag handle with one hand, while she talked on the net with the other. 800 meters to the exfil, 4 minutes to the helicopters. She made the math out loud so the others could hold on to it. Her team sergeant was Eli Mercado, and he had taught her the floor of a room exactly like the one she would stand in 10 years later. Taught her, when she was a brand new captain who knew everything, that the commander's only job in the worst minute is to be the calmest heartbeat in the building. He was 33 years old that night, and he had a wife and a daughter who was learning to walk. And he was the last man out of the collapsing structure because he put himself in the door to cover the withdrawal. And that is where he was hit. She reached him in the open and got a hand flat on his chest the way you do, as if a palm could hold a life in, and he looked up at her, and he was not afraid either, because she had learned it from him. "You hold the room, ma'am," he said. His voice was very steady. "You always hold the room. Now get them home." She carried him. He weighed more than the world. She carried him the 800 meters, and she did not stop, and she did not put him down. And on the floor of the helicopter with her palm still on his chest, she kept telling him the math, the minutes, the distance, the same flat voice, and somewhere over the dark ground, between the compound and home, the steady look went out of his eyes and did not come back. She wrote the letter to his wife herself in longhand 3 days later, and she went to the funeral and stood at the back where the family would not have to carry her grief on top of their own, and she held a little girl who was learning to walk and who would grow up on the legend of a father she would not remember. She kept a photograph of him in a drawer she rarely opened. She learned, in the years after, to live alongside the simple, unfixable fact that she had done everything right, and a good man had died anyway, which is the hardest arithmetic a commander ever has to carry, because there is no number you can subtract from it to make it smaller. They gave her the Distinguished Service Cross for that night. She never wore it where anyone could see. The word stuck to her forever. Shadow 6, the one who held the room. And so did the weight, and so did the stillness, because a person who has carried a man who weighed more than the world out of a place, worse than any clean blue room, learns a calm that nothing afterward can move. A boy with a headset and a borrowed sense of authority did not register on that scale. He never could have. The memory closed the way they always closed, on her hand, flat against a steel deck for one beat, palm down, holding nothing. And then it was 1:20 in the morning again, and the scanner was in front of her, and a young lieutenant's thumb was reaching for the reader. Easton pressed her badge to the scanner and made his speech. He could not help himself. He had a crowd, and he had certainty, and he had reached the part of the night where a smaller man mistakes momentum for being right. He held the laminated badge against the reader by the door, and he turned his head so the floor could hear him over the mission traffic. "This," he said, "is what happens when people wander onto a real floor and decide the rules are for everybody but them. You badge in, you badge out. The system knows who belongs. Watch. The machine doesn't care about attitude." He grabbed her upper arm with his free hand to march her through the door. And for one instant the woman moved. Her free hand came up and closed around his wrist. It wasn't a strike. There was no violence in it at all, which was somehow the most frightening part. It was simply a grip, fingers and a palm, but it closed with the slow, total, unarguable strength of a person who had once dragged a man 800 meters by a drag handle and not let go, and Easton felt his entire forearm go still inside it, as though it had been set in stone. He could not have pulled free. He understood that immediately and completely, in his body, if not yet in his mind. He understood, for a single second, that he had made a mistake whose size he could not see. Then she let go. She chose to let go. She returned her hand to her lap and her eyes to the wall, and she gave him back his arm because she had decided to, and the decision was hers, and had always been hers, and he knew it. It is one thing to be overpowered. Every man who has ever been a boy has been overpowered, and the memory of it fades. It is another thing entirely to be held, effortlessly, by someone who could have done far more, and simply elected not to be shown your own helplessness as a courtesy, a thing extended and then withdrawn. That does not fade. Easton would feel that grip on his wrist for years, in odd, quiet moments, and each time he felt it, he would understand a little more of what it had been trying to tell him. The reader, under the badge, did not beep refusal. It chimed. It was the wrong chime. A low double tone that the veterans on the floor knew, and the young ones did not. And at the security desk, the panel that had been a calm green changed, all at once, to a color most of them had never seen it show. Crandall was nearest to it. Crandall read it first. "Sir," Crandall said. His voice had gone thin and high. "Sir." Easton did not hear him. He was still holding her arm, still mid-speech, still waiting for the machine to embarrass her. Then the wall flickered. Every screen on the two-story face of the room blinked at once and rekeyed and came back. And the access line that ran along the bottom of the main feed, the line that named who on the floor was authorized to see what was on it, resolved to a single entry and locked. One name. The feeds the whole room had been watching all night. The mission, the markers, the element going through the door 8,000 miles away, re-authenticated themselves to one clearance and held there and would not let go. At the watch commander's empty station, a phone lit up and began to ring. Easton, at last, felt the change in the room, the way you feel a temperature drop. He followed Crandall's stare to the security panel by the door. He looked at the clearance tier glowing on it. He had never seen it before in his life. He had not known the system went that high. The clearance tier on the panel was above anything Nolan Easton held. It was above anything almost anyone in that room held. And it was the same tier, now locked across the entire wall of feeds, which meant the mission the floor had been running all night, the markers, the element, the man behind the dark door, sat inside the authority of the woman in the cheap blue jacket, whose arm he was still holding. Salinas finished it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room had already gone the kind of quiet that arrives ahead of bad news, and into that quiet, the command sergeant major said the name the manifest had refused to show, the name he had finally pried loose from the system a moment before, and he said it the way you say a name you should have recognized an hour ago. "Lieutenant Colonel Cassidy." The floor stopped. Every head that was not bolted to a critical task came up. The word "Colonel" moved across the room like a pressure wave. Easton's hand was still on her arm. He could not seem to make it let go. His mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. And then the heavy doors at the head of the floor swung inward, and the room got to its feet on its own. Major General Edmund Stryker came onto the floor the way commanding generals come into rooms, which is to say, the room rearranged itself around him before he had taken 3 steps. He had come down for the critical phase, as he always did, to stand behind the controller and watch his people work the last hard minutes. The people on the screens, the element going through the door. Shadow CX's element, though no one on that floor, except Salinas, had known until 90 seconds ago whose element it was. Stryker scanned the floor out of habit, and his eyes found the woman in the blue jacket standing by the door with a young lieutenant attached to her arm, and his whole bearing changed. 2 stars on a man do not often change bearing. His did. "Shadow 6, he said. He said it across the whole room, plainly, with something in it that was not surprise but recognition, and under the recognition, unmistakable respect of the kind that cannot be performed or faked. He had said the call sign before he had said anything else, the way you greet the one person in a building whose name comes loaded with more than a name. "I didn't know you'd made it back stateside in time to stand your own watch," Stryker said, crossing toward her. "Nobody told me you were on the floor. If they had, I'd have had the decency to bring you a real cup of coffee." He stopped in front of her, and then Major General Edmund Stryker, in front of his entire night watch, brought his hand up and rendered honors first. A 2-star general saluting the woman the lieutenant had called Sweetie, the woman he had called a fraud who played soldier in her head. "Ma'am," Stryker said, "the whole floor's been watching your people work all night. Somebody should have told them whose people those are." The room came to its feet the way a tide comes in, not all at once, but completely, and without any chance of being stopped. Chairs scraped back along all 3 tiers. Watchstanders who could leave their positions stood. The ones who could not sat at a kind of attention, spines straight, eyes forward. It rolled from the front of the floor to the back, and it did not stop until every person in that cave of blue light who was able to be on their feet was on their feet, facing the back corner, facing her. And on Nolan Easton's face, the night played out in order. First confusion. A general was saluting the contractor, and the machine had said a word he didn't understand. Then disbelief. The name, the rank, the clearance, the impossible tier on the panel. Then recognition, the slow, horrible arrival of it. The woman whose arm he was gripping, the woman he had mocked and threatened and tried to drag off the floor, was the ground force commander of the operation he had been so proud to be watching. Every marker on that wall, every life on that net, every minute of the night he had treated as his, all of it was hers. Then horror, plain and total, the horror of a young man who has just watched the floor fall out of the world. His hand came off her arm at last. He stepped back from her, as though the arm had been a live wire. Stryker's eyes moved from Cassidy to the lieutenant, and the warmth went out of them entirely. "Lieutenant," the general said, "step back from my ground force commander." Easton was already stepping back. There was nowhere in the room far enough to step. The reckoning was quiet, which made it worse. Major General Stryker did not raise his voice, and he did not need to, and that absence of noise was the most frightening thing the young lieutenant had ever stood inside. The general looked at Easton for a long moment, and then he turned to the watch commander, who had arrived at a near run with the ringing phone finally answered, and the color drained from his face. "Relieve him," Stryker said. "Now. He's done on this watch." It happened in under a minute, the way these things do once they begin. The headset came from around Easton's neck. Another officer slid into the battle captain's chair, and the floor's work closed over the empty space where Easton had stood, as smoothly as water closing over a dropped stone, because a mission does not pause for any one man's disgrace. The watch commander took Easton 3 steps off the floor to the edge of the blue light and dressed him down in a low, flat voice that carried further in the silent room than any shout would have. He did not dress him down for failing to recognize a lieutenant colonel out of uniform. Nobody could be blamed for that. He dressed him down for the other thing, for the hand on the arm, for the word sweetie, for building a performance of cruelty on a stranger and inviting a crew to laugh, for the simple ancient failure of treating a quiet person as a thing because they were quiet. Crandall stood at the edge of it with his face burning and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and because he understood that he had laughed, and that the laughing had been part of it. And while the reckoning happened, the woman it was about turned her back on all of it, because there was still a mission on the wall. Lieutenant Colonel Marin Cassidy stepped to the senior controller's shoulder, and she stopped being the woman in the blue jacket and became the thing she had been all night under the cheap badge, which was the calmest heartbeat in the building. She watched the markers. She asked 2 short questions and got 2 short answers. When the aviation push came up again, she had already turned toward the right quadrant of the map. And when the moment came that the floor had been holding its breath toward for hours, when the element was through the door and back out of it, and the call came across the net that they were clear, that they were moving, that they were feet dry and turning for home, she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second and then opened them, and only then, with her people safe, did she acknowledge the room that was still standing for her. "Thank you," she said to the controller. Then, to the floor, quietly. "As you were. Watch your feeds. They're not home yet. They're just on their way." The room sat slowly. The mission ran on toward its quiet end. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this story find the people who need it. It was Stryker, later, in the small hours after the helicopters were down, and the element was home, and the floor had gone back to its low hum, who wanted to end the young man's career. He found Cassidy by the coffee mess, finally holding a cup that was warm, and he told her flatly that the lieutenant would be moved out of the unit, that a letter would follow him, that a battle captain, who laid hands on someone on his own floor and performed it for a crowd, had shown the unit who he was, and the unit should believe him. Cassidy listened. She had a way of listening that made a 2-star general wait for her answer. "No," she said. Stryker raised an eyebrow. "He's a young officer," Cassidy said. "He was loud in a room he didn't understand, in front of people he wanted to impress, and he reached for the worst version of himself because nobody had ever shown him there was a better one available. If you end him tonight, the only thing he learns is that he got caught. Let him learn the real thing standing up. Leave him in. Make him better. That's harder, and it's worth more." Stryker looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had carried Eli Mercado 800 meters, who had held a collapsing compound with 30 lives in her flat, steady voice, who had been called sweetie an hour ago and had not so much as raised her chin. He had learned long ago that the people who had paid the most were almost always the ones least interested in collecting. "All right, Shadow 6, he said. "Your call." It always was. She found Easton at the edge of the floor before she left, where he stood like a man who had not yet decided whether he was allowed to keep existing. She did not tower over him. She did not need to. "Lieutenant," she said. He looked up. "2 things, and then I'm going to sleep, because I've been awake for a day and a half, and I just brought everyone home." He waited. "The first, the badge I was wearing as a cover. You couldn't have known what it meant. Nobody's blaming you for not recognizing a colonel in a blue jacket. Let that part go," he swallowed. "And the second, ma'am?" "The second is the one that matters." Her voice did not get harder. It got quieter, which was worse. "You decided I was nobody, and then you built a show out of it for the crew. You didn't do that because of my badge. You'd have done it to anyone quiet enough to take it. That's the thing to fix. Not the part where you didn't know who I was, the part where it wouldn't have mattered to you who I was." She let that sit. "Fix that, and you'll be a good officer. Maybe a fine one. Don't. And the next quiet person you decide is nobody might be the one whose name ends up on a wall, with you never having known." She let him keep his arm this time, and his career and his future, which was the whole point. Days later, there was a wall. It stood in a quiet place with a long row of names cut into dark stone, and the morning was gray and cold, and there was almost no one there. Lieutenant Colonel Marin Cassidy walked the row the way she walked everything, without hurry, until she came to one name among the many, and she stopped, and she lifted her hand and laid 2 fingers against the cut letters. Sergeant First Class, Eli Mercado. She stood there a long time with her hand on the stone, in the same stillness the watch crew had mistaken for meekness, the stillness that was actually the heaviest thing a person can carry, held perfectly level. A respectful pace behind her, in uniform, stood Nolan Easton. He had asked to come. She had let him. He did not say anything, because he had finally learned the one thing the Ops Center could not teach him, which was when to be quiet in the presence of something larger than himself. After a while, Cassidy spoke without turning around. "He taught me to hold the room," she said. "First captain's command I ever had. I thought I knew everything. And he stood right next to me and showed me that the commander's only job in the worst minute is to be the calmest heartbeat in the building. He told me that the night he died. He said, 'You hold the room, ma'am. You always hold the room. Now get them home.'" She traced the letters once more. "I've held a lot of rooms since. I've never stopped hearing him." She turned, finally, and looked at the young lieutenant who had called her sweetie and lived to become a better man for it. "The least I can do," she said, "is teach you the same. You hold the room, not because it makes you the biggest person in it, because the people on the screens are counting on the one voice that isn't afraid. That's all command is. The rest is noise." Easton's eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it, which was its own kind of growing up. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Carry one more thing," she said, before they turned to go. Every name on this wall belonged to somebody who, on some ordinary afternoon, was the quiet one in a room full of louder people. Somebody walked past every one of them once and decided they were nobody. Then a night came, and they turned out to be the most important person in the building, and most of the people who'd walked past them never found out. She looked down the long row of cut letters. "Don't be the one who walks past. That's the whole job, Lieutenant. The rest of it they can teach you in a schoolhouse." They stood together a while longer in front of the wall, the woman who had carried more than the world, and the young man who was only now beginning to understand what that meant. And then they walked back out into the gray morning, and the long row of names stayed behind them in the cold, where the valor lived that never needed to shout. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.